Well, welcome everyone. I'm Larry Pearl. I'm managing editor for Energy and Climate Report with Bloomberg BNA. We are a regulatory publisher that focuses on environmental and many other policy issues. I have here with me Jim Marston and Laura Miller. I'm going to do some very brief introductions. Then Jim is going to speak and Laura will speak for a little bit. And then what I'd like to do is get the ball rolling with the question, and I'd like to open up to audience interaction and participation early on and get a dialogue going between you and the panelists. So first, Jim Marston is the founding director of Environmental Defense Fund's Texas office, where he currently works. He is also vice president for U.S. Climate and Energy for Environmental Defense Fund. He has played a key role in many of the legislative and regulatory developments in the energy and climate sphere in Texas over the years, including development of the state renewable portfolio standard. He's also played a key role in state developments across the country, particularly when he was director of state climate initiatives for EDF, including development of AB 32, California's global warming law, which was the first state law to set a statewide cap on greenhouse gas emissions. I also have Laura Miller. She is currently director of projects in Texas for Summit Power Group. They are a Seattle-based power plant developer. They are developing the world's first 400 megawatt integrated gasification combined cycle power plant, which will have 90% carbon capture. She previously served as mayor of Dallas and also on the city council for Dallas. And before that, she was a newspaper columnist and investigative reporter in Dallas, Miami, and New York. So, Jim, please.
So the question is, can we keep the lights on and stay green? I bet you expect me to say yes to that question, and the answer is, in my mind, yes, if, but we have several ifs. Number one, we've got to get the policies right. We've got to get some practices right, too, but the first thing is we've got to get the governmental, both legislative and regulatory policies right. Number two, I think we actually need to be honest and recognize that there are shades of green. We will not be able to have a no-carbon electricity system in this country or any place in the world immediately. Probably never, but we certainly will not get to a very low number right away. So we need a transition there, and we need to define things as green that are greener than what we have now. And finally, we need to recognize that things are going to change over time, and that what the system we need by 2030 or 2050 is not what we're going to start with today or tomorrow. There was a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal, who has, for the last several years, run a drumbeat against renewable energy, including more than one series about the myth of renewable energy. But 2 weeks ago, they actually ran a piece rebutting the myths that they brought up. And they didn't quite say we were wrong, but if you'd read over history, you would think they should beg for forgiveness for making so many bad predictions about where renewables are going and actually misstatements about the facts. I won't go through all 6 of the myths that they debunked, but as somebody who, going back to at least 1999, has been a big advocate of renewable energy and has seen it work in our state, let me start with the fact that the old notion that this is a niche or small resource has been exploded. In the U.S. now, 5% of a lot of our power in the entire country now comes from wind. In Texas, the number is much bigger. On February 9 of this year, 28% of our power on that one day came from wind. The number is going to go up dramatically in the next few years. We have a lot of new wind projects going up. Also, people say, well, that's just one day. Well, let me tell you, the total power in Texas last year that came from wind was 9.2%. By the way, we are by far the biggest consumer of electricity. California has about twice as many people, and we generate and use roughly twice as much electricity as California, 4 times per capita, and we're at 9.2% in 2012, up from 11.3% in 2011. This year, almost certainly the number of kilowatt hours, megawatt hours used in Texas from wind will be more than 10%. And on top of that, we have some real amounts of hydro, growing some amount of solar as well. And frankly, so let me make sure everybody understands, that is not an accident that we have that kind of wind. Sitting next to me is a former mayor, but also the wife of a very great state representative who I got to work with in 1999 to pass the first really big renewable portfolio standard. We designed it in ways that were intended to let the market work, and it did. And we set a standard to double the amount of wind power in the country. That was 2,000 new megawatts of wind we were supposed to have by 2009. We blew past that in 2005. We raised the standard, and now the amount's growing so much that we've gone past any number you want to set. We don't even worry about a state standard. Policies that drive new technologies do work if you design them correctly. And the wind in Texas, which has created a wind revolution across the country, is proof of that. I also want to make sure that I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of what large amounts of intermittent renewable resources cause later on. But I want to, for a minute, talk about non-wind and non-solar resources. We are reducing our greenhouse gases in this country. Part of it's because of renewables, but also because natural gas is replacing coal. In the long run, we cannot have the kind of level of greenhouse gases we need and still have so much of our energy coming from fossil fuels. But in the short term, replacing coal with natural gas powered plants and doing it right and reducing the amount of methane that's leaking from natural gas is a big part of reducing greenhouse gases, and doing so gives us a little breathing room. Frankly, sadly, our politics are broken, and not just with regard to the shutdown or the sequestration, they're broken with regard to climate. And the problem is so severe and time is so short for acting, we can't simply do nothing in the interim. And because of that, we have decided to try to minimize the impacts of natural gas on local folks and on local land, and try to maximize the climate benefits as a transition to the opportunity for renewables. But I will say natural gas is not the only clean technology out there besides renewables, and we need them all right now.
Thank you, Jim. Laura?
Well, I'm going to explain to you why I've spent the last 6 years of my life building a coal-fueled power plant. When I was mayor of Dallas from 2002 to 2007, we had a briefing one day at the city council. It was an all-day environmental briefing, and one of the folks that came to speak was Smitty. I don't know if you know Tom Smith from Austin, but he's with Public Citizen, and he's quite a character. And I've known him many years, and he's worked with Jim and Cyrus Reed and lots of folks in Austin for a long time. And Smitty came up to our city council meeting, and halfway through it, he said, this was 2006, he said, you know, right now in Texas we have 18 coal plants, and there is a plan afoot to double the number of coal plants in our state. And I said, what are you talking about? Like, that's not possible. And he said, yes, it is. There have been, oh, thank you. Keeping the lights on, yes. So it turned out that, if you all remember the big TXU fight, but in 2006, TXU alone, TXU based in Dallas, proposed building 11 old technology coal plants, which is pulverized coal, where you take coal and you burn it, and it goes up the smokestack. And then as all the particles are going up the smokestack, you try to grab the sulfur out of it and the mercury out of it, and forget the carbon. Back then in 2006, there was no such thing as carbon capture. It was carbon capture ready, and which was an enormous misnomer. And there's another environmentalist who is as famous as Jim Marston right here, whose name is Dave Hawkins in Washington with NRDC. And his famous quote about carbon capture ready was, "Carbon capture ready is like the garage that I am building at my home to house the Ferrari I hope to own someday." It just doesn't exist. So during this period, I turned to the city council and I said, there's no way that we, the 9th largest city in America, can allow 18 dirty coal plants to be built in our state. So we agreed to start an opposition to the coal plants. And I went around the state and got 36 mayors and county officials and school board members to join a coalition that we formed to fight the plants. Interestingly enough, in Texas, the burden is not on the coal plant developer to show that they're really clean. It's up to the people that oppose it to prove that it's really dirty, which is a very high mountain to climb. So we raised $600,000 in public and private money. We got an amazing law firm out of Houston called Sussman Godfrey to take on the case pro bono and represent our whole coalition statewide. And then we mounted a very aggressive fight against the plants. When it was all said and done, we had beat up so hard on TXU because they had 11 of the 18 permits and they were all being expedited by the governor, fast-tracked. There was so much hullabaloo about it that Jim Marston was able to come in on behalf of EDF and the other environmental groups and cut a deal with the company that bought TXU, KKR and TPG. And instead of 11 dirty coal plants built, there were only 3. So that was better than 11. But through that experience, I think, well, number one, I had a visceral reaction, as some of you might, to the idea of building old technology coal plants that don't capture carbon. For 2 reasons. One, I had breast cancer when I was 39 years old, and I do think that if you pollute the air and water, you make people sick. And number 2, I was jogging once in San Diego, and I turned a corner and I went right up behind a dirty trash truck that hit the gas as I turned the corner, and all the particulate matter, I don't know if you know what particulate matter is, it comes out of every coal plant, hit me in the face. And I decided that something had to be done about these kinds of issues. So after we mounted the effort, I left office, and some of the environmental groups said, why don't you go around the country and teach other mayors how to fight dirty coal plants? And I said, I think that is a waste of time, because in states like Texas, it doesn't matter what the opposition does, most of the permits are going to get approved. Luckily, in the majority of states, that's not the case, but as you know, in Texas, it's a higher hill to climb. Secondly, if you spend the time to go after each and every coal plant permit, it just seems like it's very laborious, it takes a lot of time, it's not very efficient. So instead, I went to Europe with a coalition of environmental groups that looked at coal gasification. Coal gasification is not like pulverized coal. With coal gasification, you don't burn the coal. You crush the coal, you put it in a gasifying vessel, and you heat it up to 3,600 degrees with a little bit of oxygen, and it vaporizes the coal and turns it into a gas. And once it's a gas, you can strip off the components. And there are 2 gasification projects, coal gasification projects, in America, and they've been making electricity since the mid-1990s, and they were built by the Department of Energy. They were built with tax dollars. And when I was fighting TXU, I kept saying, we need to build gasification. Why are all your plants pulverized coal? Why aren't they gasification? And TXU said in every debate, gasification doesn't exist. It's a myth. And those 2 plants that you keep talking about that DOE built, they don't work. They're not reliable and they don't operate half the time. So I had to fly to Florida to see one of the gasification plants in Tampa so I could come back to Texas and in debates with TXU prove that the plant was working and was making electricity. And that is the model for how to do a coal plant in 2013. So the project that I've been working on ever since this period is a coal gasification project. And through that trip that I went to Europe to see other gasification projects in Europe, the environmental groups said there's actually a company in America that not only is building gasification, this was 2006, but they're capturing the carbon off the plant. And I said, but no one's doing that yet. It's all talk. And they said, no, this company is, and it's called Summit Power Group out of Seattle. So I have been with them for 6 years, and I have been trying to raise the bar on coal plants for 6 years by building a project that gasifies coal, that has extremely low emissions, the lowest of any power plant that will be built in this country. We are by far, we have our Texas air permit, we're by far the lowest emitting coal-fueled plant in the state. And we are going to capture 90% of our CO2. There isn't a power plant in the world today at a commercial level that captures its CO2. There's one project being built right now in Mississippi called Kemper. It's being built by Southern Company. And they will capture 65% of their carbon. And they also are doing coal gasification, very, very, very low emissions. As an example, with gasification, you take the sulfur from the coal out of the gas, and then you make sulfuric acid on site for the farming community. So none of that sulfur goes up in the air. All that acid rain, nothing goes in the air that's sulfur. It all goes into another product. So I know that I am all for renewables. I'm a big D in an R state, and I care very much about the environment. I'm very distressed that our generation is not united in worrying about climate change, because I think that it would be a very different political situation if we were. I believe my children's generation is unified on that issue pretty much, and I think they're going to be the ones to take action, but it's too late to wait for them. So we have to do something now, and it's people like Jim Marston who have spent 25 years of their life trying to make something happen that will hopefully, at the end of the day, win. What's ironic about our project, as we all know, one of the big challenges is no matter how much we all drive Priuses and recycle and do all these things, the Chinese and the country of India are not really where we are yet. And what's really hopeful about our project, we have a $450 million grant from the Department of Energy for our project. Our project is more than $2.5 billion, our project. We make more than electricity, though. We make urea fertilizer out of some of the gas from the coal. We take all the CO2 and compress it, use it in the oil fields in West Texas to bring up more oil. So it has multiple products with multiple revenue streams, which is why it is viable and going to make money for the people that are funding it outside the government. But what's really fascinating is that one of the main participants in building and financing our project is the Chinese company Sinopec Oil, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And they currently do a lot of coal gasification, but not for electricity, it's all for chemicals. And they want to know, how do you do coal gasification and use it to bring up more oil? We want to learn about enhanced oil recovery. We want to learn how to capture the carbon and put it down in the oil wells and bring up more oil. And so I think it is a very positive, extremely positive development that China and America are partnering on a project of this significance that will be able to show the rest of the world that if you want to build a coal plant in 2013, you better not do one that pollutes. You better do one that is very, very clean and that captures its carbon and sets an example for every coal plant that's built after 2013. Thank you.
Thank you. So Laura's remarks lead a question for me. Given the fact that we have, from what I understand, several centuries worth of coal reserves, can we transition to a clean energy economy using the current range of sources that we use now in terms of coal, natural gas, moving to wind and solar and so forth? Jim, you talked about needing the right policies. You also talked about how renewable energy, wind, solar are growing in this country and elsewhere. Given the topic of our panel, keeping the lights on, my question to both of you is, how are reliability and other concerns with renewable energy in particular being addressed? And what do you see as the key obstacles that are still out there?
Well, first, I think we do need some smarter policies about prices. We need a price on carbon, like we ought to have a price on every other part or every other cost of a manufacturing process. That's Adam Smith 101. And the fact that we allow fossil plants to pollute the atmosphere with impunity and without cost skews the system. But that's really what we were trying to do with the cap and trade system or a carbon tax. That's not going to happen right now for reasons that are hard to fathom when you look at the science. There is a majority of the elected officials in one party want to deny the science and therefore deny action on that. If we had that price, the market would solve this problem, but we don't have that price. So that means you've got to do some other things. We need, and some of the things are being done right now. So under the Clean Air Act, the Obama administration, under orders from the U.S. Supreme Court to do something about carbon pollution, has done regulations on new coal plants. And frankly, the standard they've set requires new coal plants to do carbon capture and storage. Those who claim you cannot physically do that are just, they just need to go to Mississippi and soon to Odessa, Texas, and see that they're being built and it can be done. And of course, they can be done at reasonable prices if you're smart about marketing the byproducts like the CO2 and using it for enhanced oil recovery, or the sulfur and using that as a fertilizer. Number two, you need policies that value the clean electrons. Right now, we tend to pay only for the average electricity value of rooftop solar, but the market is missing a ton of value, such as deferred distribution resources. You don't have to build as many substations or transformers. It's a peak resource. We ought to be paying folks for peak power for solar. It also is a hedge. It's a zero-cost fuel. So these companies are spending billions of dollars hedging by going to Wall Street and buying hedge instruments. The smartest hedge is to have a fair amount of your fuel be zero cost. So we've got to change the market, and frankly, we've got to deal with intermittency, but I'll wait for another question to talk about that.
Sure. Laura, do you have anything?
Yeah, a couple additional issues. You know, obviously storage is a big issue. Wind works when it's blowing, sun works when it's sunny. There are lots of people doing R&D on battery storage, and you know, how do you capture all that solar power but then have a place to store it so that when the sun disappears you're still able to operate. So that's an obviously gigantic issue that will be solved, but it's still nevertheless very important. I also want to mention, you know, Jim mentioned in his opening remarks that only about 5% of U.S. generation is from wind, but just to think about the magnitude of that, it seems small, but we're the second largest electricity generator in the world. So of that 5% that we're generating, that's more than all the electricity being generated today in Australia or Saudi Arabia. It's half of what's being generated in Mexico. So it really is a large volume that, like Jim said, will continue to grow, especially in our state. One issue, though, is the NIMBY problem. When you have a very environmentally conscious U.S. Senator like Ted Kennedy say, I love wind and I want it to expand, but I don't want the wind turbines off of my beach house in Cape Cod because I don't want to look at them, that's a problem, and that's not going to get any better with time. Everybody loves a wind turbine unless it's in their backyard. It can be noisy. There are lots of different problems with, and as you know, wind and solar take up a lot of U.S. geography. It's a very large scape that you have to have for those kinds of technologies. So that is another issue that I think is a potential barrier to having it just be expanded even when storage becomes an issue. And then I agree with Jim totally about the politics. You know, one of the reasons why wind and solar keep sputtering and they haven't grown even faster is because every single year Congress says, well, we don't know that we want to continue the subsidy for solar and wind, so we're going to debate it for 6 or 8 or 9 months, and at the last second, on the last day before it expires, we're going to, okay, King's X, we'll do it. But by then, you have an entire year where developers have not spent the money to develop wind and solar because they don't know if they're going to get the credit after they buy the turbines and they're ready to put them in the ground. So that is an enormous, enormous problem. And I think if we were much more united on a political front on all of these issues, it would be astounding what we could do in terms of a strong renewable and clean energy portfolio that includes carbon capture.
Do you think that's feasible, getting united on the political front?
I don't know. What is that saying, that people must rise up?
Okay, I think there's someone with a microphone who can pass around. So what I'd like to do is to open up to audience questions, and by all means, ask Laura and or Jim questions, but feel free, other audience members, feel free to respond to questions as well, so we can get a bit of an interaction and dialogue going. So.
Hi, Melita Elmore, formerly of Carbon Capture and Storage Association in Texas. Good to see you both. I'm wondering if I could get sort of both of your thoughts about not only the recent EPA coming out saying that carbon capture is going to have to be looked at for coal plants, but my understanding is they also are putting some of those same kind of conditions on natural gas plants.
Yeah. Well, gas without carbon capture is better than coal right now. But if gas is going to play a significant role in the electricity mix in the U.S. and really around the world, before long we're going to have to also capture the carbon and sequester it from natural gas. I'll let Laura tell the story about the legislation in Texas, but it has to happen, and we need the technology, and frankly, the technology we're doing on coal plants will help on natural gas. So we actually supported the subsidy for Summit because we think we need to prove the technology. I'll say another thing is we will get to a very high percentage of renewables in the U.S. pretty quickly. The prices are going down. The numbers of growth are astounding. In the last, a third of all the solar that has ever been put in place in the world was put in last year. The number is just going like the growth is big, and once you get to a certain percentage, the math works. But India and China are continue to build plants. They're going to use their coal in the ground. We better figure out how to get the carbon from their plants out of the atmosphere. And the U.S., I think, has an opportunity and an obligation to prove the technology.
Just to give you an idea of the difference between the carbon coming off a gas plant and a coal plant, which I know you know, but some of the others in the room may not know. If our project captured 65% of its carbon off a coal-fueled plant, that would be as clean as a natural gas plant in terms of carbon. The fact that we're capturing 90% of our carbon makes us cleaner than a natural gas plant, which is very interesting. So it then, I think, begs the question, well, if you can take coal, which is a much worse, today, without this technology being in place everywhere. Obviously, today, coal plants account for about half of your CO2 problem in America. So when you think about it, why not insist that gas plants also capture carbon if you're actually starting to build coal plants that are cleaner than the gas plants in terms of CO2? And since it is easier to capture the CO2 off a gas, which is what we make from the coal, it makes sense then that you should be able to capture it also off natural gas, which you can. So it's a technology that is also available right now, but it's a whole new kind of concept that the government's now saying you need to take it off of a gas plant. Texas is interesting because we passed a law in 2009 that incentivized coal-fueled plants that capture at least 70% of their carbon in Texas. So for the first 3 that get built, you get certain state financial incentives. Well, this year in the legislature, the natural gas power plant developers came forward and said, hey, we want one of those 3 plants to be a gas plant because we intend to start capturing the carbon off gas plants, which is a good thing. So we changed the law, and now of those first 3 that are going to be built, 1 can be gas. So I think you're going to start seeing a lot more gas projects being proposed that also capture their carbon. So the world has completely changed since 2006 when I was out, fighting these dirty coal plants. I mean, today you really don't build dirty coal plants in America anyway. It's very difficult to do. Hopefully that'll be the case around the world.
Coal gas, I got the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Coal gasification is cool. I guess I'm feeding back here. I didn't realize about the coal gasification. I think it's great. Thank you. One thing that we've talked about solar, we've talked about wind and some other things, but I've been asking this question for a number of years, and I typically tend to get the same answer. And people look at me like I'm saying something about matter, antimatter. And I think Jim may know where I'm coming from here. What about nuclear fusion? Everybody says 50 years out in the future. 10 years ago, they said 50 years out in the future. 20 years ago, they said 50 years out in the future. What about nuclear fusion?
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems is fusion has been this silver bullet on the horizon for a long time. Clearly it works in theory. Theoretically it works, but whether we can capture it at costs that will be affordable, even compared to very expensive technologies now, is unclear. We are not ideologically anti-nuclear at EDF. We try to be open to all low-carbon solutions because we think global warming is so severe and the time to act is so short. But not just fusion, but you know, current new nuclear technologies seem astronomically expensive. I got a chance to talk to the mayor of San Antonio, who's considering signing on to a project with NRG to build a new coal plant, new nuclear plant. And I said, if they'll guarantee the price, the price they're telling you now, I'd sign on to it. The developers wouldn't guarantee the price. That's the problem.
You know, it's really a shame what happened with Japan, because I have always been since my coal plant fight, I've been a big proponent of nuclear. I mean, I went to some of the aluminum plants that were built in the 70s out in East Texas, and just touring the plant, you couldn't like touch anything because your hands would be black. And so just think about, after 40 or 50 years of these things belching in the air, just think about what's going on with the environment. And I went to the Granbury, Texas nuclear plant, and it was amazingly, shockingly clean. I mean, you could eat an egg off the floor, it was so clean. And if they could figure out, if they could recycle the fuel the way they're doing in France, which is amazing, why can't we do that? Why do we have to have every nuclear plant have rods sitting in their backyard? It's horrible. And if we could stop building nuclear plants in dangerous places like tsunami areas and fault lines, then I think that it's an important generator. It's wonderful that there are 0 emissions.
Hi, thank you very much for this topic. I would like to regress a little bit with regard to the old dirty plants. Is there a possibility at all to retrofit those to keep them from being the beasts that they are? Is that economically not feasible, or is it something that's just not okay with the companies that own them?
Thank you for asking that. Just like the Department of Energy gives grants to do new construction of plants like ours, they also give grant money and tax incentives to companies that have existing coal plants that want to capture the carbon off of them. And the most famous example was AEP's Mountaineer project. They had a big coal plant, huge coal plant in West Virginia. They did a pilot program using a grant from DOE. They took a slipstream of the existing emissions off the plant, and they were able to pull off a significant amount of CO2, so it was very successful. So they applied for more money from DOE, and then their goal was to take the grant, a couple $100 million, add their own private money, and then capture 90% of the carbon off the plant. So it was a terrific project. But unfortunately, it's a regulated state. We're not regulated, so the plant that we're building, we can't charge it to the consumers. Whatever it costs to make electricity, we can't just put it in the rate base. We have to absorb it ourselves, and the people that build our project, they're either going to make money or they're not going to make money. But it won't affect consumers and what they pay for electricity. In West Virginia, that was not the case. So AEP made it clear, if we do this project, it's going to be very expensive for us, even with the DOE money, so we're going to put the cost of that in the rate base, and the consumers will have to pay it. And their Public Utility Commission said, no, we are not going to allow you to do that. The consumers are not going to pay for that. And therefore, they scrapped the project, okay? So, in our country, the best pilot program for capturing carbon off an existing plant was withdrawn because it is thought that we, the consumers, don't want to pay to clean up the environment. Now, perhaps that's just politics, perhaps the PUC was wrong, perhaps the consumers wouldn't have cared, but there have been major battles in other states around the country where citizens are saying, my electricity bill is already too much and I don't want to pay it. And that's another obstacle that we have to doing all of these things that are important to do.
Now, NRG in Texas has a plant in Fort Bend County where they've received a grant to retrofit their parish plant. They told me this month that they're going to try to break ground later in 2013. They think they have all their financing lined up. A problem has developed for the coal industry, frankly. They had one hell of a deal back with the Waxman-Markey bill that gave lots of money for subsidies and for R&D for carbon capture. They and their allies in the oil industry sunk the comprehensive climate legislation. So folks who were willing to make a deal with them to make sure they had a place at the table indefinitely, including us, are a lot more sanguine about continuing to play with some of those companies. And frankly, natural gas prices have gone so low because of the fracking technology that lots of coal plants are being retired simply for economic reasons. And you know, I think the coal industry violated the rule about be careful what you wish for, and they're getting whacked in this country, probably deservedly so. We do, though, need this technology, and we need to prove it and get it on the ground, in large part because India and China are going to burn large reserves of coal, and we need to do something about that. But there's not the grand bargain that could have cleaned up the coal plants at some cost, but relatively minor cost if you do it smart like Summit is, has gone away. Frankly, I think also the politics are so bad on climate. The only reason why you do carbon capture and storage is because you worry about climate change. And if you're denying that it's a problem like the politicians are in West Virginia or in Texas, it is hard to get projects through because you have to admit there's a climate problem if you spend money on climate change. Fortunately, in Texas, we have interesting other politics that allow us to get our projects through. But I think in some ways, West Virginia turned down that plant because they didn't want to admit that climate change is happening.
So I want to step back for a second and look at the larger policy sphere and ask both of you. We've talked about renewable portfolio standards, subsidies, tax credits, the new regulations on carbon from power plants that were just released by the Obama administration. Do we need to have government mandates and subsidies to advance clean energy? And what is the role of public versus private sector in this sphere?
Well, in the long run, I think the answer is no. There's a recent study that says by 2020, renewables can compete on, wind and solar can compete on price without subsidies. Though I argue, and a lot of calculations have been done, that coal, nuclear, gas subsidies far outweigh any subsidies that renewables have gotten to date. And that does not even include the so-called hidden cost or the externalities of pollution that subsidies that they're getting. So yes, the answer is, I think already in Texas, wind competes even with very low natural gas prices. Solar is dropping dramatically. The cost of solar components is come down more than 50% in the last 3 years. We need to figure out how to reduce the cost of installing solar, but there are ways to do that. It will be competitive pretty soon.
I like to use the example of catalytic converters. In the 1950s, the catalytic converter was created to put in cars to keep all that dirty particulate matter from flying out into your face. And all the car companies said, oh, we can't put that in our cars because the cars will be so expensive then that we won't be able to sell them, people can't afford them, and so there was this huge debate about it. Well, as you all know, they all went into cars, they were all required, the cars cleaned up, and now the cars are cleaner than ever, and technology is, you can't even imagine, right, having a dirty tailpipe. We all call in the guy that's in front of us on the highway who's got emissions coming out of their tailpipe. And that's what it's like for our project. Without the government grant, we couldn't build the project. And that is because, obviously, it is more expensive to build a power plant that captures 90% of its carbon than one that just lets all the carbon go up in the air. So how do you afford that? We are affording it by doing lots of products and making money through different revenue streams. But the beauty of the grant is that by taking the $450 million from the federal government, which means from you, we sell all those products at market rates. So the city of San Antonio is buying all of our power for 25 years, and they're able to shut down an old coal plant and buy our power instead. And because of that, we're not, well, what's nice about the grant is we are charging the city of San Antonio no more money than if they were buying the power at market rates, even though we are 1,000 times cleaner than what they've been able to generate recently with an older coal plant. And we're only able to do that because of the grant. After you build the first one of these, then you start figuring out the efficiencies and all the people that are building it, they don't get so nervous about the fact that you're taking known technologies. I mean, people are capturing carbon just not off power plants. They're doing it on chemical plants. There's one in North Dakota right now where they're capturing the carbon and they're piping it to Canada and they're doing enhanced oil recovery like we're going to do with it. And there are lots of power plants that are doing gasification around the world. But to combine that two together is what's new. So it really isn't risky, but because the guys building it think, oh, well, we haven't combined this before, we need to kind of add contingencies and make this a little bit more expensive than we will when we do the second, third, and fourth one. So the day will come, I think, when all the technology is caught up to the market and we won't have to have subsidies like this for energy production.
Back there.
Yeah, my question is about the use of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. If your concern is about reducing those emissions, how are you going to ensure that that CO2 stays in the ground and is not released during the process of removing the oil or afterwards?
Yeah, another very good question. People don't realize that in Texas, oil producers have been doing enhanced oil recovery with CO2 since 1972. It's just not man-made CO2, which is pretty ironic. So there is 3,400 miles of dedicated CO2 pipeline in West Texas and the Permian Basin. Now, where is the CO2 coming from since 1972? It's coming from caverns in New Mexico and Colorado. So ironically, again, the oil producers are going into the ground, taking out CO2, and piping it to West Texas to put in oil fields to bring up more oil. So won't it be a lot better if we start capturing all the CO2 that's man-made and putting it in the pipeline instead, and we shut off the natural CO2 and stop taking that out of the ground? Also, since 1972, the first field that used CO2 was called sack rock. And the University of Texas has studied sack rock since 1972. And it has recently written a paper, or is currently writing a paper, that states that there is no leakage from sack rock since 1972 of the CO2 that's been put in the ground. Unlike a saline aquifer where you take the CO2 and you just store it underground, and that's where it's being stored if it's not being put in oil wells. That's where all the R&D money from DOE is going right now around the country, including the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology. They get a lot of money to do demonstration projects. And what they're trying to figure out with the saline aquifers is, if you put the CO2 down there, where does it go? Like, where does it move? And as you know, it's a very porous underground universe down there. So if they put it in one aquifer, does it move to another aquifer? Is it a permanent closed vessel, or does it just sit there? And that's all the R&D that's going on for saline aquifers. That's as opposed to the EOR, which has been going on since 1972. When CO2 goes in the ground to loosen up the oil that's on rocks, that's what it's really doing. When you first go in and pull out oil, you use a machine. You only get 18% of the oil out of the ground. The second time they go in with high pressure water and they water flood the well, they get another 10% out. So you've got 50% or more of the oil that's still down there. And the only other way to get it is to put the CO2 down there, which acts as a solvent and loosens up the oil off the rock, and then you pull it all out. And then the CO2 that comes back up, you re-inject. So you're constantly recycling the CO2. And and whatever CO2 stays in the hole stays clung to the rock. It stays down there, and the University of Texas has shown that that's in fact what it does. And Texas is very smart, because when we passed the law that gave financial incentives to the first 3 clean coal plants in Texas, the legislature said those 3 plants shall make sure by law that 99% of the CO2 that goes in the ground stays there for 1,000 years. And to be sure it does, the developer of the project, us, has to hire the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology, and they will develop a plan to monitor that CO2 on infinitum, and the producer will pay millions of dollars, the developer will pay millions of dollars to make sure that UT monitors that CO2. So it's a very, very impressive system that our state has created. Sorry for the long answer.
Yes. Hi, I'm Jennifer Lassiter, and the question I had was in relation to a comment that Jim made relatively early, in that he's seeing it's going to take maybe 20 or 30 years for a lot of the renewables, like solar, wind, like hydro, biomass, other various things. And I was just curious, in light of some of the things said yesterday afternoon regarding like the Peers Inc. model that Robin Chase was speaking about, and organizations that allow widespread public participation, like 350.org, like how that might exponentially drive potentially policy and innovation. Just because if there's suddenly this exponential shift in public opinion where people won't invest and they're boycotting fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas, any of your thoughts on how that might impact things? Thank you.
Well, I think you are describing the future, and I think it's inevitable. I think we're now seeing great shifts in distributed generation. We'll see a lot more backyard and on-roof power, and part of it's because new technology, part of it is new communications, part of it's citizen activism, and it's happening, and the growth in rooftop solar is the really underreported story of the last 2 or 3 years. And it's happening in lots of places. TXU had a program, a several $million incentive program. They sold it out in less than 2 hours. People want it. Let me say a key thing to make this happen is we've got to do something called demand response to deal with the issue that Mayor Miller talked about, which is the wind does not blow all the time and the sun does not shine all the time. Of course, I tell my friends who build coal plants and have a smokestack fall down, coal plants don't work all the time either, and the wind always blows sometime in a year, unlike the TXU plant that was out for more than a year, but that's a different story. The secret to integrating large amounts of intermittent renewables is more than one thing, but more and more people, including me, agree that a key part of that is something called demand response. And demand response really means turning off non-essential uses of electricity. In the old days, demand response was sending home Lone Star Steel, when we actually had a steel plant in Texas. They're closed down for other reasons. But now with technology, there are companies who are cycling off air conditioners on a 20-minute basis. In San Antonio, there's a company that's working for the utility there that turns off hot water heaters and swimming pool pumps. And eventually, you're going to have a system that will have sensors over your solar panels, and as soon as the clouds come over, they turn off things like defrosters and things like dryers and lots of other things that can be done anytime, day or night, and therefore match the load of the demand load to when renewables are available, as opposed to simply trying to have more generation then. The need for backup natural gas plants will be a lot less necessary, and then also we're making strides with regard to batteries. But let me tell you a statistic that makes an environmentalist cry. We have all this wind in Texas. A lot of it is from West Texas, and it blows more at night than it does during the daytime. The good news about coastal wind is it blows almost all the time, but the West Texas wind blows at night. 7% of our wind that we now generate is being wasted, not used. It is grounded essentially at night. This is free power with no carbon cost, no carbon emissions. And if we can move some of the load tonight, we could use that for almost no money and reduce our emissions. So that's the great news is all sorts of folks have new technologies to make that happen.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Dixon with the Wilderness Society, so I appreciate the conversation that we've been having about carbon. But one of the things that you had said early on, Mayor Miller, was that you believe those that pollute the air and the water make people sick. And so I'm just interested to hear how the project that you're working on, while it captures 90% of the carbon, what is it doing to address the pollutants that actually make people sick or fish our waterways, mercury, NOx, and SOx, and those kinds of pollutants?
Well, you know, the mercury doesn't come up the stack and then fall into the air and then land in your water. One of the most important things that I was able to show people when I was going around the state and I was fighting the coal plant construction is that virtually the entire Gulf Coastway and all the lakes, Caddo Lake, all the lakes in East Texas, have had fish advisory warnings from the state for 30 years, saying you should not eat, if you are pregnant, more than 2 fish that come out of any of these lakes or along the Gulf Coast because it has high levels of mercury due to coal plants, which is unbelievable. I was shocked how long that they've been full of mercury. In our project, the mercury no mercury comes out the stack, and all the mercury is taken out of the gas. More than 95% of it is taken out of the gas through a rectisol system. So again, it's hard to describe, but when you think about an old coal plant where the coal is burning and everything is going up the stack, and then people are putting on machinery to try to take the bad stuff out of the smokestack. Well, that's a very inefficient way to do it. But if you're taking the actual lump of coal and you're turning it into a vapor in a vessel, and then you're able to, within a closed system, pull out, reassemble the particle, the chemistry of it, and pull out the offending pollutants that would otherwise go in the air and end up in the water. You know, we don't have any ash, we don't have a big sludge ash pond at our coal plant. The only thing that comes off the gasifier are glass beads that are non-leachable, you can't break them, and we just sell the beads to concrete companies to create texture in roadways. So it's a completely different animal. And the one thing I want to say in closing, because I know we're going to end in a few minutes, I find the biggest challenge to all of these issues is education. And most of what America and other countries hear about all these issues is what people say during political campaigns and what politicians say when an issue gets brought up that they have to vote on. And then we all hear all kinds of remarks that may or may not be accurate. And I know that when someone asks me, oh, what have you been doing since you were mayor? And I say, oh, I am working on a coal gasification project that captures carbon, their eyes glaze over, and I have lost them. They don't want to talk to me anymore because they could care less. Most people, like an engineer might say, how interesting, and then he'll talk to me. But a big problem with it is just education. And so it's frustrating. And back in the mid-90s, when the U.S. government built coal gasification projects, they didn't have carbon capture, but these were great projects. And because they did break, and they didn't run 24/7 sometimes because they were brand new, first-of-a-kind plants, all of the coal plant developers that were not doing gasification, that were doing the old style, were able to use those mistakes, those early kinks, to trash the entire industry. And that's why no other gasification was built in America since the mid-90s. And this generation of plant has got to be built. And if it's not built, and we're not going to capture 65 and 90% of the carbon, that same group of developers will say, see, it doesn't work and we cannot do it. And that's not true. So these plants must get built, and all citizens must help, and they must embrace it, and they must pay a little bit more money at the end of the day to get clean energy.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question in the back.
I have a so I don't need the mic. I'm Lucy Stoltenberg with the Texas Solar Energy Society. Jim, I've been meaning to meet you for so long.
Hi.
So here we are. A couple of things. When I was driving in this morning, I heard a DOE report that the expectations on the cost of heating fuel this winter, natural gas is going up 13%. I think that is going to affect people's love affair with natural gas right now. That's a huge amount for folks. The other question I have is, we've talked about carbon capture and clean coal, but water. Maybe I missed it, but I haven't heard, is there perhaps less water used with that?
We are not using drinking water for our project. We are using brackish water from the Capitan Reef in West Texas.
Is it water that is actually consumed or just withdrawn?
The water will be withdrawn, and it'll have to have reverse osmosis. It'll have to go through a desalinization process in order to make it clean enough to even use in a power plant. The city of El Paso is very progressive. They have a 25 million gallon a day capacity. They have a desal plant where they are able to provide the water for the whole city and also the base, the military base out there. And they get the water from the same source, the Capitan Reef, which is a giant underground lake. But the water is so brackish and salty that you cannot use it unless you build a very expensive desalinization plant and you take all that out of there. So I also think that's really the future for all power plants, that they not be able to use people's reservoir drinking water.
I do think we ought to note that a nice thing about PV solar and about wind is they essentially are water free. And right now, most of the power plants in Texas are receiving subsidized water, another subsidy that the proponents of fossil fuels somehow forget about. But as water becomes scarcer, and this drought record almost certainly is part of the new normal where we are going to experience here, resources that don't use water at all, or certainly if they only use brackish water, are going to become more valuable and more important.
All right, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone, for coming.